Hello and welcome to our webinar today, E911 Planning for Avaya. I'm Michael Anderson. I'm the National Sales Director for 911 ETC, and now get the presentation started. And alongside me is Kevin Keto, the Director of Sales Development, and he'll be going through some of the more technical portions of the presentation. Some of the items on our agenda today, we're going to do a brief E911 overview, what it is, how we work with Communication Manager, CS1000, IP Office, and 1X Communicator. We're going to talk a little bit about VoIP environments, configuring ELEs and URLs, which we'll explain here in a moment, talking about whether or not you want to do subnet or switch port level discovery. These are all things you have to consider when implementing or planning for your E911 implementation, as well as call delivery. Is it going to be SIP, PRI, or other? Talk a little bit about the NENA model legislation. NENA is the National Emergency Number Association, and talk a little bit about the state legislation updates. And at the end, we will take questions if anybody has any, and try to get through all those as well. So what is E911? When implementing E911 or multi-line telephone systems, they create a barrier for outgoing 911 calls. You must ensure that your system will, first of all, provide the correct location information. Secondly, you must ensure that the call routes to the correct public safety answer point because of a bunch of reasons that Kevin's going to get into and explain here in a moment. Something that we always talk about with customers is that you should always include on-site notification, which it could be crisis alert in Avaya, or it could be additional software that can give you additional information. But it's very important. We talk to public safety answer point people who work at the dispatch folks, and it's always nice if someone's waiting for them at the door to escort them to where that emergency is if possible. And obviously you want to comply with the current E911 legislation. Unfortunately, the legislation is not uniform from state to state, so there has to be some planning on, are you just going to meet the legislation requirements in each state, or are you going to standardize on the most stringent legislation? So those are some of the things that you must need to take a look at. And I'm going to let Kevin get into some of this, some of the more technical aspects of this. And go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks, Mike. And so one of the first things that you really need to consider when you're implementing an enhanced 911 solution is what kind of granularity do you want to be transmitting to the PSAP, and also what type of granularity do you want to be giving to those people on site. You know, the old school way of doing things was the desktop level granularity, where each individual phone had its own unique identification as far as where it was at. So you could go all the way down to a room level. And the reason for this was because back before the advent of voice over IP phones, pretty much everybody was digital and analog. And when somebody wanted to move a phone, they needed to talk to somebody in the telecom department, ask them to move the phone. So moving that phone and knowing where that phone was pretty easy, because somebody would have to go there and then they could update a database. And in some cases, this desktop level granularity is still valid. There's some states that actually have legislation that do, kind of push companies to do desktop level granularity. And then there's other organizations that actually they decide themselves that they want to do desktop level granularity because their environment is such that it really doesn't make sense to say, hey, they're on this floor, and they're on this part of this floor. We have a company that we just implemented here in Southern California where they wanted to do desktop level granularity for that fact, because they said that we have a lot of locked offices and we have offices behind other offices. And even if we just gave a general area, it would take them 15, 20 minutes probably to find somebody. So they wanted to get very specific with their location information. The second level of service that a company would want to do for basically giving location information is what's called setting up ELEs, or emergency location extensions, and URLs. And what that is, an URL is just a zone, and it can be a floor, it can be a part of a floor, or it could actually be all the way down to a desktop level. An ELE is just a phone number. It's a phone number that will be used when somebody dials 911. That's the phone number that's going to be outpulsed. They're actually not going to be outpulsing their own phone number. And this next slide will kind of illustrate to you that setup. So it's kind of the same setup as the desktop level, this building with 2 floors. But in this scenario, instead of giving each individual phone number its own specific location, they're grouped into sides of floors. So for this customer, they have first floor, west wing, And all these phones on this side of the floor, they're all going to outpulse the same ELE, 626.555.0001. And the reason for that is because with voice over IP phones, people could pick up their phones and move them on their own or log in and out of phones, and nobody really would know where they're at. And so this is a way to combat that. So when somebody picks up their phone and moves from one location to another or from one floor to another, the phone number that they outpulse gets changed. And that's the phone number that's in the E911 database, and the location information for that phone is in the E911 database. And so this is really a great way to combat that. It also can make it so it's a lot less management on the customer's end. Because when you're doing desktop level granularity and you're having people move the phones and updating a database, this is something that could get missed. When it's in this scenario, when somebody moves the phone, there's some software or maybe even the system, the PBX can actually be set up to track that phone moving from one subnet to another. And that's another thing when Mike was talking earlier about what level of granularity do you want to do as far as the discovery level. Customers can do IP discovery via subnets. So if you have your subnets set up in such a way that makes sense for E911, TM can actually do that discovery itself. So when a phone moves from one subnet to another, it'll see that change and say, oh, this phone is over in this subnet now, change the ELE value of this phone. But if a customer, say they had a 5-story building and the entire building was a subnet, or they had subnets that span multiple floors, you really can't use subnet level discovery anymore. You need to use switch port level discovery, which is you have to know where every single switch port is within the entire organization, and you have to be able to upload that information into like a software database or something like that, so that when a phone moves from one switch port to another, the system can say, oh, this phone is now connected to this switch port, and this is the ELE that needs to be assigned to it. Now, it can be something that some customers like to manage, but going forward, it can be pretty difficult because you really need to make sure that nobody pulls a wire or changes a wire, or if they do change a wire from one location to another, then they need to update the database and say, hey, this switch port is no longer located on the first floor, now it's on the second floor, now it's on the west side versus the east side. Okay, so these are, again, some things to consider. The next thing is routing of the 911 calls. Are you going to have local trunks at each one of your sites? Are you going to have a centralized core where all voice traffic goes back to? Several of our customers have gone to that who have national sites all over the country where they'll have just maybe 1 or 2 data centers where all 911 traffic will go to. And if a call were to be originating, say, in New York, and it would go to, say, a data center in Atlanta, when that call goes to Atlanta, if they don't have a solution set up like a voice phishing server or a voice phishing center solution set up, that call is going to go to an Atlanta 911 center. And even if the person on the other end of the phone in Atlanta says, okay, I believe you that you're in New York, because they're actually trained not to believe the person, they're actually trained to go off of whatever the screen pop says. If they did say, hey, yeah, I know you're in New York and I'm going to transfer your call, they don't have a way of transferring that call to New York. The best they can really do is maybe call into the admin number of the New York servicing PSAP that services that address. So there's some real problems that can occur here. So some customers will keep local trunks at each one of their sites just for 911. But like I've heard of companies say, well, we'll just keep a POTS line at each one of those sites. Well, that can become pretty costly. And the other thing is POTS lines are usually limited to just one call. And so if you had multiple calls coming from a place at one time, then what would happen to that second call or the third call? So those are some of the things to consider. The way that we combat this with our solution for Communication Manager, IP Office, CS1000s, and also 1X Communicator. That's another thing that we really haven't talked about yet, but 1X Communicator or any type of soft phone that a customer might have, those are some things that you really need to start to think about is, hey, what's going to happen when this person logs into a hotel or they go to a Starbucks or they go to a McDonald's or whatever? How are we going to know where that person's at? And there's some stuff that we can do at now on ETC here that can combat that phone movement. But let me get into exactly how the solution would work. You would have a database, and you would take all that information, whether it's the desktop level granularity of each individual phone or just the ELE URL information. So if you can give us that information and load it into our voice positioning server prior to a 911 call ever taking place. This is all done prior to the 911 call taking place. And there's 3 different methods that we can really get that information to us. You can simply fill out an Excel spreadsheet, which is what a lot of our customers will do when they're just doing ELINs and ERLs. We can give you direct access into a dashboard, or you can fill out some kind of a database you already have and auto-export that into our voice positioning server. So there's multiple different ways, and really we can bend the solution to fit whatever way you want to give us that information. So what actually happens when a 911 call takes place is the call is going to go back to the PBX, and the call is going to get pushed to 911 ETC in one of two ways. There's even other ways that customers can do it. These are just the two primary methods that most customers will use. We call PST and handoff. It's really just a call going over a PRI, or we can take the call via SIP. And there's some pros and cons to each one of these. We can, if you wanted to get more information on that, you just contact us after the call. We can, discuss, what are the big benefits of doing SIP, what are the big benefits of doing PRI. But again, these are just some of the things that you need to consider when you're planning for an E911 solution. So once the call actually does come to our voice positioning server, we're going to match up this phone number with the database that we have. And we're going to say, okay, this phone number is located at this address, on this floor, maybe in this building. And we're going to route that call to the correct selective tandem router that's local to the user. And then that call is going to get pushed on to the correct servicing PSAP, where they'll do a data dip and say, oh, this phone number is located here, and they'll get a screen pop with the location information where that call is coming from. Okay. And this will work even if the user who is dialing 911 is not local to wherever the PBX is. Again, this is not incumbent upon this call being routed directly to the selective tandem router out of the PBX. The call will get routed to us first, and then we'll route that call appropriately to the correct servicing PSAP. The next thing that can happen is you have remote offices, you have at-home workers, and I talked a little bit about this earlier about the 1X communicated users or soft phone users. So for those users, there's no way to auto-discover that somebody is just at a McDonald's or a Starbucks or some hotel. So it does take manual intervention by the user to be able to say, hey, where are you at? And one of our customers, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I was talking to him about, hey, you can have this link where you can go in and your users can update your location information. And he says, my users really aren't going to use that. They're just going to fire up their soft phone and use it. And I said, well, what if we had some way of forcing them to update their location information? And so I went back to our techs, and it's a good thing we have some really smart guys here working at now in ETC. They were able to come up with a product called SoftLoop that can be loaded onto those laptops and prompt the user to update their location information. Prior to us deploying this for a lot of customers, the E911 solution that I heard of most was they would put stickers on laptops to say, don't use this to dial 911. And really, that isn't really a solution. Obviously, somebody in an emergency, that may be the only device that they can get to. As more and more people start using soft phones, it becomes second nature. When soft phones first came out, people were like, oh, no one's ever going to use a soft phone to dial 911. But as you become more and more accustomed to using something, it just becomes your device. So this is what you use for everything. And so it's more and more likely that people will be using their soft phone to even call 911. And so that software will prompt the user to update their location information. It'll communicate with the voice positioning server and put the right location information in there so that when a call does come to our voice positioning server from one of those soft phones, it'll route to the correct servicing PSAP and deliver the right location information where the call is coming from. Okay. One last thing that can happen is if, say, a customer added a user or an at-home worker or an office or even a new floor to their building, and that call were to come to us and that phone number wasn't in our database, we wouldn't be able to automatically route that call. So this is kind of like the last ditch effort to get this call routed. This would never be a primary method, but this is something that's kind of a backup method, is we would route that call to an emergency call center where somebody would talk to them, find out what their address is, and then they would manually route that call to the correct servicing PSAP. So again, this is something that is just kind of like a backup method to make sure that there's the last ditch effort to get that call routed to the correct servicing PSAP with the right location information. Okay. And again, like Mike was saying, if there are any questions, please feel free to fill out the question bar. We'll answer all the questions at the end. Okay. So some of the guidelines that MLTS or NENA has for MLTS in the model legislation is to allow all 911 calls to go out without dialing any prefixes. I'm sure most of us have heard of the story of Carrie Hunt, where she was in a hotel, her daughter tried dialing 911. She dialed 911, I think, up to 4 times, and she never got out. And the reason for that is because the hotel that she was in required a 9 to be dialed before 911. And, a child or even people who are adults, they're not going to be thinking about that. They just think, hey, 911 is the number to call when you're having an emergency. And so you got to make sure that this is just a function of the PBX. Make sure that you allow 911 calls to go out, even if there's no 9 dialed before. I have heard of other companies who said, well, the reason that we did that was because we were getting so many missed dials for 911 calls. But it's really what the NEMA model legislation says, to say, hey, you really need to allow 911 calls to go out without any prefix. Allow all company phones to dial 911, kind of like I was telling earlier about soft phones. There's even been some companies that I've heard that have try to block it on soft phones or any VPN connected user. Well, they will not allow the 911 call to go out. And if you're providing a 911 or providing a device to your users, you do need to allow for 911 calls to go out. And then provide precise, accurate location data automatically whenever 911 call is placed. So you want to give not just the building or maybe the door that the person should be coming through. You need to give them the right location information. I was at a recent conference, and there was a fireman there. He was just walking around. He was scanning the building, and I talked to him and I said, hey, what kind of information do you want to have when you're coming to a site? And he brought up something that I never really even thought about. He said, I really want to know exactly where I'm going. And the reason that I want to know exactly where I'm going is when I am on my way to the fire or whatever type of emergency I'm going to, I'm getting myself in the right mindset to help somebody. And if I have to, when I get there, try and figure out where I'm going, I get into a different mindset. And maybe it's different for every single police officer, ambulance, or fireman, but it was really interesting to get it from perspective from somebody who was right there actually responding to the calls. And the biggest reason they wanted to get that specific location information. They don't want to be thinking about, hey, what floor am I going to, what side of the floor? They want to just know ahead of time, this is where I'm going, and then dealing with just what the emergency is and getting in that right mindset. You also want to have on-site notification to provide to gatekeepers or security staff, so that if there is a location information given, that we can help those people get to that right place. And also if there are first responders on site, that maybe they can go there and help with the emergency. Maybe if there was a gunman on site, you could have security staff going there. It's really a good idea to have some type of on-site notification to notify people on site that somebody has dialed 911. And here's another big one: no local termination of 911 calls. I've heard of companies say, well, we have a 24/7 security staff, and we route all 911 calls to that security staff. And that can be dangerous because if maybe that person, for some reason wasn't there at that desk, even though it's manned 24/7, Murphy's Law, something's going to go wrong, it usually does. You really want to have that call routed to outside the organization, because, like I said, there could be numerous different reasons why that call will not actually get out of the organization. And this is another big one: testing 911 calls at least twice per year. Things can change within the system, and people think, oh, this is not going to affect anything, and they forget about 911, and maybe the way the route was going for 911 calls, maybe it was supposed to be going out via SIP, and they changed that route pattern. Since 911 calls obviously not being called every single day from most organizations, you really want to make sure that you're testing those calls at least twice per year to make sure that those calls are terminating at the right place and giving the right location information to the 911 operator. Okay. So the next slide here is just our legislation page. You can go to 911etc.com/legislation, and there you can go and click on all the different state legislations. The unfortunate thing is pretty much every single state has different legislation. It's not like there's one standard that everybody uses. The state of Louisiana and the state of Florida will say you need to get it down to a desktop location, or you need to be capable of getting it down to a desktop location. The state of Illinois says you need to get it down to a 40,000 square foot area or per floor. And there's a lot of different iterations of granularity and what you need to be able to do for all the different states that have legislation, and also even the pending ones. Their legislation is kind of a hit or miss as far as exactly what it is. So, just to wrap up, some of the things that you want to consider as far as what is the different things. You want to know what granularity you're going to be doing for location information. You're also going to need to know what type of call delivery method is it going to be. You're going to need to find out when you're doing the granularity, when you're doing IP discovery, is it going to be subnet level? Is it going to be down to a desktop level? Or it can be a combination of both. There's some companies that we've worked with where they do they do mix and match, where they do subnet level and then they do switch port level. So, and also even with the call delivery method, you can do two types of delivery methods. Avaya Corporate, they're actually one of our customers, and they have it where they do both. Some sites, still only have SIP. Some sites have PRI, and sometimes they'll use PRI as a backup, where SIP will be the primary delivery call method, and then it'll be also a backup using PRI. So, like I said, even Avaya Corporate has implemented a E911 solution, and they understand the importance of it as well. All righty. So with that, I'm going to be turning this back over to Mike and see if there are any questions from the group. Mike?
Yeah, we got one right here. What is the difference between SIP and PRI delivery? Is there any, I guess what we're asking, is there any advantages of using SIP or PRI?
Yeah, well, there definitely is. With the SIP call delivery method, there's what's called 933 test calls. It's kind of one of our big features for 911 ETC, where customers can, rather than having to set up appointments with the 911 operator and figure out a time to do this, they can just do a 933 test call. And what happens with those calls is, rather than it routing all the way to the PSAP, it goes to what's called the PSAP simulator, where it'll read back the information that would have been presented to the PSAP. And one of our other companies that we're working with, Wells Fargo Bank, they love that, because whenever they're setting up new sites, they have thousands of sites all over the country. Whenever they're setting up a new site, they just want to do a 933 test call rather than always having to do a test call all the way to the PSAP. Some of the other things that are nice about SIP call delivery is there's no accidental misdials in the PST and access phone numbers. That's something that can come up with really any solution where you're using PRI call delivery, where you can have somebody misdial into that phone number. With SIP call delivery, you really don't have that method. And in addition to that, we can also provide onset notification via email and text. Email and text, it's kind of a backup method for onset notification. We really prefer that customers, if they're going to be doing some type of onset notification, they do onset notification via like software or something within the PBX to make sure that things are on site. Because when you're doing email and text alerts, there's no guarantee that email or that text is going to be delivered immediately, because we've all had spam blockers that grab emails. And then also text messages. We've all had text messages that delay, 4 or 5 hours sometimes, and those need to be really immediate. So those are kind of some of the benefits. But that answers the question, Mike. You think anything to add to that?
No, I think you answered it perfectly. That's the way I would answer it. One other question I see is in the event of sending out ELINs, or ELEs, how do they call that person back? I'm sorry if you addressed that already.
No, that's actually a really, really good question. Well, you're exactly right. If you're not outpulsing the own individual's phone number, how is that call going to get routed back in the case of a hang-up? And there's some debate on exactly where that call should go. There are ways to, within the Avaya PBXs, to automatically have that call route back to the last person that dialed 911. It's called ELE extension forwarding. And so what happens is it'll hold that phone number in a queue for a certain amount of time, and when somebody dials that phone number, it'll route that call back to the last person that dialed 911. But there's some debate, like Mark Fletcher, who's the product E911 product guy at Avaya, he really thinks that calls should actually get routed back to like a centralized security. And the reason for this is, he says, well, if somebody is making a 911 call and they're actually in an emergency, and for some reason they hung up that phone, what are the chances of them actually picking that phone back up and answering it? Because if they hung up that phone, maybe they were forced to hang up that phone, and they're obviously not going to, if there's a gunman there or something, they're not going to allow them to pick up that phone. And if they were having some kind of a medical emergency, then maybe it was an accident, they hung up the phone, and they may not be able to pick up that phone again. And so he says that call should actually get routed to a centralized security who's been given onset notification and says, okay, we know where the call is coming from. Because in reality, the only way that person who actually hung up that phone is going to pick up that phone is if it was an accidental misdial. So it's really, each individual organization is different. I would say it's probably about 50-50 almost, as far as what we've seen, as what organizations do, whether they have that call route back to the last person that dialed 911, or that call gets routed to a centralized security or maybe a person on the floor.
One other question. I have PRI today, but I'm moving to SIP next year. Can I implement this using PRIs and then transition over to SIP, and what does that entail?
Yes, definitely. We've done that with several of our customers, because there's a lot of customers that are doing exactly that, where they're PRI now and they're moving to SIP in the future. And the transition is, there's a lot of work that has to be done on our side, now in ETC. On the customer side, they just really have to start, instead of routing that call to the PST and access phone number that we would give them over the PRI, they would just need to set up the calls via SIP and push the calls to us via SIP over the internet. And as far as costs go, we don't even charge our customers to make that move. We really prefer that customers are SIP, and we don't want to have it be a cost issue to say, hey, we're going to start moving the calls to us via SIP.
Well, I don't see any other questions, so give it a couple more seconds if anybody else has any questions. Fire away on the chat bar, but if not, I guess we'll conclude the call.
And Mike, I actually do see a question here. Maybe I'm not sure if maybe you're not able to see it, but one of the questions that I have here is, so the actual media portion of the 911 call goes through the E911 voice positioning server. Yes, the call would actually get routed through our voice positioning server, and it's really just a redirect. It's just to see the phone number. Okay, we have the address information. This call gets routed to this PSAP, and it's just a redirect. It's not like there's actually somebody sitting there waiting for the calls to come in. The voice positioning server will just bounce it off of our servers and push it to the correct servicing PSAP. And there's another one that says, do you have a handout that shows the legislation in each state in more detail? Yeah, if you just go to our website, nowonetc.com/legislation, you can go there and you can click on the individual states' legislation. There's a brief synopsis that we have for each state, but you can actually click on, there's a clickable link for each state that will actually take you to the actual legislation for the state. And we really suggest that companies have their legal departments look at the legislation, because we've had multiple different companies look at legislation and they all kind of interpret it differently. About 7 years ago, 7 years ago, when Massachusetts came out with their legislation, I was talking to a financial institution out there, actually 2 financial institutions, and one of them saw the legislation and they said, well, not only do we need to cover all the people here in Massachusetts, we need to cover everybody across the country and also into Canada. Because if we're covering one set of group people, we need to make sure that we're setting up everybody with Enhanced 911. And the other company said, well, there's no penalty for not doing it, so we're not going to do anything. And I was like, wow, it's just like these 2 companies looking at the exact same legislation and interpreting it completely different. All righty, let me read this other one. All righty. This is kind of a long question, but basically what the question is saying, does our software, or does the software that we can provide, can it interface with some kind of internal databases? And yes, it actually can. We partner with Conveyance Systems to provide on-site notification, and they have a product called Sentry that can be integrated to pull information from multiple data sources. So it can pull a map from a different place. It can pull, you can have a link in there to have an IP camera link. You can have temperature sensors. There's a lot of extra information that you can put in there that can help. One of the customers that we're working with is Princeton University, where they created a system where it would actually draw a little line to say, okay, this is the best way to get to this person. So it can definitely do that. Okay. Let's see here. Let's get a couple more questions. Okay, there's a question about cell phones, kind of a long question, but it's basically just saying, how do we handle cell phones? And what needs to happen with cell phones is most applications that are put on cell phones, when a 911 call is placed, it will actually shut the application down and use the cellular network to transmit that call. I have heard that with some of the latest releases of some other like 1X communicators and things like that, it's not doing that anymore. But really that's the only way that, when somebody's outside the organization, for that call to be routed to the right place. Because if they're internal to the organization, there are some methods of getting to the closest Wi-Fi access point to be able to give location information to the 911 operator. But once they get outside the network, again, there's no way to auto-discover that somebody's there unless you have access to the cellular network. Okay, does legislation dictate whether other systems can interface with a 911 locator software or database? I'm not quite sure what that question is asking. But legislation really doesn't dictate much of anything. It just basically gives you guidelines on what you should do as far as what granularity you want to do and whether or not you should be implementing the solution. Okay, in terms of allowing 911 to be dialed without a prefix, what have been successful strategies to minimize the number of missed dials by users? One thing that I have heard for some companies, what they've done is they've actually changed the access number from 9 to like an 8 or a 7 or something like that. That's probably the one that I've seen that's been the most successful. Other than that, I haven't really heard of any other things. I guess there is one other one. I wouldn't really suggest it, but there's one that I've heard of people making a delay, where if certain, there's some kind of a delay with the phone, it won't actually dial 911. I really don't think that that's a good solution. If people are thinking about that, it's probably not best practices, because you never want to put any kind of a delay in a 911 call, or at all. Okay. And there was a question about just the difference in CM versus IP Office versus CS1000. That's actually something that I wanted to get into too. Is this communication manager has a lot of things that were inherently built into it to be able to track phones when they move from one location to a location. It also has crisis alert for doing on-site notification. CS1000 has similar ways of tracking phones when they move from subnet to subnet. And IP Office, I've heard that there's ways to do that with an IP Office itself as well. But really, they're fairly similar in most aspects. The biggest difference being the on-site notification, probably, of saying, hey, how are we going to do on-site notification? Like I said, CM and CS1000 have ways to do, basically just telling you what extension is dialed 911. But we can provide some software again that will make that on-site notification much more robust and much more accurate and deliver a lot more location information. But really, all of them can be programmed to push calls over a PRI or via SIP trunking. And if somebody has any questions specifically for their PBX, feel free to contact Mike or myself. We can get on a call, because here's one of the other things. Probably about 5 or 6 years ago, if somebody said that they needed an enhanced 911 solution, I would really just ask them who their dial tone provider was and how many phones they had. And then I could say, here, this is the solution, and here's the cost. Things have changed so much with hybrid systems and digital phones, analog phones, IP phones, soft phones. It really takes a lot more care in designing a solution for a customer. That's why pretty much for every single one of our customers, before we just jump into doing a presentation for them, we'll do a 20-minute, 30-minute discovery call to really find out what it is they need from us. Because it's not a cookie cutter. It's not just, okay, this is your solution and here's how it works. Because even different releases of CM or the CS1000 can do different things inherently. So we really want to get to know the customer's environment before we're going to say, okay, this is the solution for them. All right, let me see if there's any more questions here. Okay, they said that there's what about digital sets? Because there's a lot of customers out there that still have just digital sets. And actually, with digital sets, you can actually set up ELIMs and ERLs for the most part with even digital and analog phones, because you can just go in there and manually change the ELE value. And that's what there's a lot of our customers that have done that. Rather than giving specific location information for each individual phone and having to update a database, all they do is when they go and move that phone, they change that ELE value manually. So that's a way to kind of combat the each individual phone and being charged for each individual endpoint. In this aspect, you're only going to be charged for the ELE values that are uploaded to the voice positioning server. There's another question about One Excommunicator and people using it on their cell phones. Is there software that we can deploy on cell phones? Again, there's really no way for us to do that, because cell phones, once they're outside of the network, it really is something that the cellular network has to control as far as where they're at, because if a person is in a car moving along, there's no way for us to to get that information to the PSAP and continually changing it, because the person would have to be continually manually changing their information. But there is some development for other things like tablets and things like that that now ETC is undertaking. Let's see here. And there's still a few more questions here. A lot of good questions. Okay, what is the path to update the database? How labor intensive is it? Well, it really can depend on the customer. We have multiple different ways for a customer to send us the location information. It can either be, like I said, simple Excel spreadsheet that they update. It can be some kind of a database that they already manage themselves, or they can actually have direct access into a dashboard where they can make those changes. But if they're doing the ELE ERL configuration, then the updates to the database are not going to be that often. It's really going to be just when there's a change that needs to be made as far as buildings. Say they added a building, or they wanted to get more granular. Really, that's going to be pretty static information. Okay. There's a couple questions about, will this webinar be sent out? We're actually recording this webinar right now, so we'll send out a recording of this webinar. And we can also, anybody who wants a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, we'd be more than happy to send it to us. Both Mike's and my contact information there. Just send us an email and we'll get that over to you. Okay, is the system licensed by IP address or phone number? As far as the cost involved, we really only are charging for the records that you upload to us. So in that case, it would just be phone numbers. So you could have 100 phones on a floor, but if you're only outposting one phone number for that entire floor, you're only going to be charged for that one phone number. Let's see here. Okay, is the ELE automatically sent if populated as CM if you do not have a 911 solution currently in place? We don't program PBXs, but from what I understand, the way that it works is if you do not have any ELE information in there, it'll just outpulse whatever phone number the end user is. So the ELE value is going to equal the phone number. And you either have to manually go in there and change it, you need to set up the subnets to force the ELE change, or the software conveyance that we would help deploy would be making that change of the ELE. So there's no automatic ELE. You have to go in there and do some programming to the PBX to get it to work. Is there Avaya integration notes for 911 ETC? Yes, there are. We can send those out. There's application notes that we have for all of our products. And you can also even just find them at the DevConnect website. Just go to the Avaya DevConnect website and search for 911 ETC, and all of our application notes are right there. Or you can, like I said, ask Mike or myself, and we'll be more than happy to get them to you. Can your solution support multiple PBXs in a hybrid environment, such as Avaya CM and Microsoft Link? Yes, definitely. Our solution is completely PBX agnostic, so it really doesn't matter what type of solution the customer has. The only difference is sometimes the on-site notification or the IP discovery will change depending on the PBX. Other PBXs have sometimes different methods of doing IP discovery and on-site notification. Is there online access to 911 ETC's server for updated information? Yes. You can, so we can have a dashboard where the customer can log in themselves. It's password protected. We also provide YubiKeys so that the login to that dashboard is very, very secure. It's not something that anybody can just have, even if they just have the username and password. And I think that is it. If there are any other questions that I may have missed, oh wait, there's one more here. Okay, it's basically just another question asking about how the call would actually be processed through the system and through the local carrier. So I can go back to our data flow slide, and what happens is the call goes to the PBX, and then it gets pushed to us over either a SIP trunk or over that PRI, and then we route that call back into the E911 infrastructure. This is actually something that's kind of important, especially if the calls are being delivered via SIP. There is some scenarios where a customer could actually have traditional what's called PS alley set up, and they're delivering the calls via PRI. And then if they move to SIP, something changes with the dial tone provider and how the calls are delivered, and then they lose E911. Even if they have, like say locator ID or Inform, or Verizon's product, they can actually lose 911, enhanced 911. And so what happens is with those customers, we have them push the calls to us, and then we reinsert that back into the network, the E911 network, and then that call gets routed to the right place. Let's see. Is the PRI terminated at the local carrier or at your facility? Mike, can you help out with that question? I'm not sure exactly how to answer that one. Is the PRI terminated at the local carrier or at your facility?
Depending on what type of solution it is. If it's PSLE, it terminates, well, it goes to the CO and terminates at the PSAP, all using your carrier's network. If it's VPC, it's going to hit our voice positioning server, and based on the ELE or the phone number we get, we route it to the appropriate PSAP. So it just depends on the solution.
And you know what, Jake, we'll give you a call after this is over to get a little bit more in depth and discuss this a little bit more, okay? Okay, I got another question in here. In the case of a number not in the database, the call goes to an intermediate emergency call center. Is this your call center or another government? Yeah, it's not 911 ETC's call center. This is basically where pretty much all rogue 911 calls go to. It's not 911 ETC's system. It's if you're using, say, like a VoIP service provider or something like that, it would really route to the same place. It's not specifically the 911 ETC, and pretty much, I think most of the E9 providers route their calls to this same emergency call center. Alrighty. Hey, Mike, why don't you answer this one here? It says, how redundant is your network to ensure your data center or server is always up?
Well, we actually have two data centers, two SBCs in different geographical locations, and then our underlying carrier actually has two as well in different geographic locations. So that's a total of four basically points that we could point the calls to. It's been vetted by some of the very largest customers out there, and we feel it's very stable and secure. So that's how we provide redundancy.
Okay, great. And to anybody who asked any questions, we'll make sure that we follow up directly with you to make sure that we did answer your question fully. If there are any other questions, please, we'll give a couple, maybe another minute here. Otherwise, we can conclude. Alrighty. Well, I think that we are good for today. Mike, do you want to close it up?
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. As Kevin mentioned earlier, we will have a copy of this presentation and recording that we can provide to you via link. So if you need it, just shoot us an email. We'll get that to you right away. Again, thanks everybody for joining, and have a great day.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.